I did put a few of the report briefs back on the back chair, if you want to take those, because it's also got the emails and all of that. And it's also important, as I do this talk, to separate the parts that are fact-based and really out of the report. So could be attributable to the committee and the National Academy, but certainly the commentary and all of that is really my own opinion. And that's one of the things that's always important when you take a National Academy report and move it into the implementation and communication phase. So many of you know a good bit about this whole process, but I think partly because some interesting things happened this time, I thought I would tell you a little bit more about the process. So committees are given tasks, and the tasks are decided by the sponsors. And the sponsors for this report, I'll show you at the end, but mostly were government and a few other groups. And the task of the committee, when we met for almost 2 years, is listed here. So think about the DRIs for sodium and potassium. Consider what we think of as the traditional problems about do you have too little and too little inadequate versus deficient, and toxicities or maybe too much, and this whole new concept of chronic disease risk reduction, which is based on chronic disease endpoints that have never been as fully implemented as we did with this report. We were also tasked with using 3 primary other bits of data, and that was part of our charge. And one is a report that had been out that is called the Organizing Framework, which I'll show you a bit about, a guiding principles report, and then an AHRQ systematic review that was commissioned to help serve the committee. And again, underlying this whole piece is this was a time from the sponsor's point of view and from the Academy's point of view that we might be able to use some of these new concepts and expand the DRI model. So again, everybody in this room knows this, but I just wanted to, as we got into this, the DRIs historically are for people who are apparently healthy, not people with diseases. That's more clinical nutrition. And of course now, if you think about it, the majority of the adult population in the US and Canada are overweight or obese, and the vast majority of us will have mild hypertension or worse by the time we're 65. So the idea that we have a lot of completely healthy people running around out there is no longer true. So as we integrate all of these other complexities, that's part of what's happening as well. But the other thing, you're very familiar with the EAR, the estimated average requirement, which means you've got a really robust data set. And if you have that with population intake, then you can go on and in the right statistical way come up with an RDA. Remember back in the old days, the whole system was called the RDAs. Now the RDA is really just clearly about a recommended intake, but based on high quality data. If you don't have really good quality data, then you fall back to Plan B, which is the adequate intake. And that's when we do not have sufficient high quality evidence to have an RDA. And then the high level had been called the tolerable upper intake level, often just called the UL. So that's what our starting point was. So using this DRI framework, again, which has come out, it's probably on the next slide, I think a couple of years ago, they were absolute specific steps our committee had to go through. We couldn't just sit around the room and look at the papers and go, okay, we think this is the news story. So the first part really is selecting and reviewing indicators that might inform this idea of adequacy or deficiency and all of that. And there's a lot of work in qualifying an indicator, like really what has the proper relationship. If you go to step 2, it becomes even more clear. To be an adequate indicator, you have to be a biomarker and a nutrient. In our example, I'd say sodium and blood pressure, that you have to be able to show that there is an intake and a response relationship, that is linear. The slope doesn't have to be sharp, but you really have to be able to say that. And it can be, one can go up and the other can go down. So you have to have that intake response. And we'll cover a good bit of that. Then step number 3 is, after you've worked through all of that, you have to compare the current intakes to what you're proposing. And then lastly, step 4, you have to think in your report a bit about the public health implications and special considerations. And there were some of those as well. So this is the Guiding Principles report. It was 2017. And this is where the benchmark, the milestone, that you cannot use data that does not at least rise to the level of moderate strength of evidence. Okay? So to get into play, to get into the system, you have to have moderate strength or high strength of evidence. But if you have lower strength of evidence or weak or all that, then you just simply don't get into the review of literature. It's not allowed in this system. So that was really very important. And then because we really were interested in exploring this chronic disease of interest, again, the idea of what was going to be the surrogate marker. Because chronic diseases, unlike our traditional deficiency disease, if I'm chasing vitamin C health, I know what scurvy looks like, right? I don't need really a biomarker for that, although the biomarker is the ascorbic acid in the white blood cell kind of thing. So we spent a good bit of time thinking about what the right biomarkers would be that could be used for evidence. And I just show you this as the very general idea that if you think of a chronic disease and an intake level and those relationships, there are all sorts of relationships. Some are, the higher the intake, the lower the disease risk. Some it's higher. Some are what we think of now as the U-shape or the J-shaped curves. Some are what we now, in deference to Canada, call hockey sticks. That you have this and then the slope stops. So within the whole list of possibilities for any given nutrient in any chronic disease, you've got to figure out which you're in. So in pursuing this idea of coming up with chronic disease risk reduction, we had to agree on which process of reviewing data that we were going to use. And the body of evidence looking for both the causality, does sodium cause blood pressure to go up or down, and the intake response is using a system called GRADE. And you can see at the bottom, this is what it stands for: grading of recommendation, assessment, development, and evaluation. And again, the actual report's like a 500-page book, and it goes through all of this very carefully. The other thing is, in this guiding principles, people who worked before us had decided that this upper limit thing wasn't working so well, and really wanted to, in essence, give some room for the chronic disease discussion, but also to say we needed to move that upper limit category to what we might think of more as a toxicology model. And so we were commissioned that we needed to do that. So now we were headed towards the chronic disease would be very distinct from the EAR, the RDA, the AI, and retain the term upper level, but different guidance. The AHRQ report, again, was commissioned, and it started before the committee was formed, so we didn't actually have input on the questions, but it really was a very useful document. And what they were asked to look at is, if you reduce sodium or if you increase potassium, what would it do to blood pressure and cardiovascular disease and renal disease? And again, this is now publicly available, and really excellent reviews in a very stylized way that you have to have for the systematic reviews. So when you get a report like this, then the committee is tasked with, do you take the report as it is, or do you see some weaknesses that you as a committee want to delve more into before you just say, yes, we take everything, on face value. And for us, we did find some weaknesses, and that's not to disparage the report. They did a very good job. They didn't have much time, all of that. But we did find some places where we felt like we needed to do some refinement. So we actually went through the process, and one of the reasons that you can downgrade evidence is that there's heterogeneity or inconsistency in the findings. When something is really robust, when it's really linked mechanistically, physiologically, you may get a different range in the outcomes, but you expect them to be in the same direction, that kind of thing. So again, we're looking at this huge, vast review of literature, and we did find some heterogeneity, and you will see if you go through the whole report that the committee made some adjustments to the findings of the AHRQ report. In addition, because we felt there were some other gaps, we took the time to do some other analysis ourselves, having a really spectacular committee with lots of skills, and having a community both in the US and Canada who were going to share primary data, that we were able to do that. So I started to take potassium out entirely, but it's come up a little bit, so I'm going to keep it in. But I'm going to cover this a little bit faster, and then we'll spend most of the time on the sodium. So potassium, what were the key findings? Looking at the question of adequacy, RDA or AI kind of values. Well, there is no consistent biomarker for potassium in humans. It's a heavily regulated molecule, right? Serum potassium serum and cellular potassium is very heavily regulated. So it is not a responsive biomarker. I can take almost no potassium or a lot of potassium, and my blood levels aren't going to change very much, and there's no other secondary physiology marker to say, oh, but this, even though the blood didn't change, you can look over here. We look very carefully at all the available balance studies, which again, in our kind of nutrition, might be very informative. Measure perfectly everything that you take in, measure perfectly everything that comes out, usually urine, stool, and sweat, and see what balance we're in. Well, as it turns out, balance studies are very hard to conduct, and most of them are going to have design flaws or other methodological points. So we didn't have good balance studies for potassium. So related to the issue of adequacy, there was insufficient evidence, once again, to do an EAR. So that's why I started with the robustness of the data. And so then what you do is you turn back to what are the median intakes of apparently healthy people to do an AI. And I just show you this as the summary of that. We were very lucky that both Health Canada and the US through NHANES had very contemporary data that we could use. And when we sorted through everything, comparing the last round of reviews was in 2005. So I just listed here what changes. So there was really only one real increase, and that was because we actually had better data on breastfeeding and complementary feeding. So the 7 to 12-month-old got a bump up. But you see everybody else in yellow had a decrease, because looking at the current data and establishing an adequate intake based on those data came up with these numbers. And one of the interesting things of those of us who sort of mix public health and clinical health, for many years, potassium has been a nutrient of interest. When we had with the school lunch and, all sort of feeding programs, the WIC basket, SNAP, all those things. Well, part of it was because the sitting DRI system had the intake so high. And when we reviewed the literature, we could not find evidence that said the population needed to be taking that much sodium. So even though we think of potassium not being the hottest nutrient and all the story is really in the sodium, this was a big change. And it was very substantiated, like I said, between really high quality data that we had from both countries. So we had that to really do the adequacy. And then we did explore this thinking about chronic disease. But we, in reviewing the literature, there were several elements in the potassium database that made this not possible to move forward. There was unexplained heterogeneity across the blood pressure studies, and that's what you often think is going to lead to the answer. The intake-response relationship was not there. When you looked at the studies, you couldn't say, well, if the potassium is going up, the blood pressure is going down, study after study. And so there was no other way to find a chronic disease endpoint that related to this. So try as we did to say, could we come up with a chronic disease story for potassium? We did not. And if you just look at this quick summary about what changed over time, in the 2005 report, they did use supplement trials that that in our view did not rise to moderate strength of evidence. They also had spent a good bit of time looking at the question of salt sensitivity. And over the last 15 years or so, again, that's an interesting concept, but the data really are not there for a public health point of view to talk about salt sensitivity, particularly in African American males, which had been called out in the 2005. And there was no strong evidence that potassium influenced kidney stones. So that's what they, completely respectfully, what they were dealing with in 2005. Our data are really based on this new high-quality median intakes. In both reports, there was no upper limit. The CDRR didn't exist in 2005, and we were not able to find a way forward with that. Okay, so then on to sodium. So again, starting with adequacy, there is no sensitive biomarker for sodium. Just like potassium, sodium is extraordinarily well controlled in the body. The blood level is very specific, the range is small, the amount that there's more sodium in the plasma than in the cells. The kidneys and all of those systems work very, very well, both to manage this. So there really isn't an off-the-shelf biomarker. It's really not serum sodium kind of thing. So then we went on and looked at balance studies. And again, the balance studies were insufficient to build a framework that would allow us to come up with really a sodium requirement that would get us into the would get us into the RDA category. When we looked at extensively at what evidence is there for harmful effects of a low sodium diet, and again, if you follow this field, there's a whole group of studies, most of them observational and have, although done on large numbers of people, really are not well designed. And so when those were reviewed carefully, there really wasn't a data point that said a sodium intake below this number is going to be harmful. You'll see how that comes back into play shortly. So in those observational studies, again, when we were talking about reports and public commentary and all of that, after our report came out, there was an interesting editorial in the Wall Street Journal that was by the group of people who feel strongly about this U-shape and J-shape curve, and again, which was very well covered in the report. But this body of data did not influence the committee's decision. Why? Because when you look at all of that, their samples often included people with many different pre-existing conditions, so they didn't meet that part about being healthy. There were a number of potential confounding variables that we and others had identified, even potential for reverse causation. And almost all of these were based on a spot urine. So one sample of urine collected any time during the day. And again, I think we probably spent half of our time talking about how difficult it is to measure sodium intake. The dietary approach is very difficult. The urine approach is what you have as the fallback, but a spot urine is almost meaningless, and you need multiple spot urines, like many, probably over a month, or you need 24-hour urine collections to be able to do the association. And they're pretty good relationships between the sodium in and the sodium out in the urine, but it's over a wide period of time. And some interesting studies on astronauts made us start to believe that way it's not like 2 or 3 days. It probably is a month, and there probably is a real cycle. So the conclusion for adequacy, again, we found ourselves, as they did in 2005, that there is insufficient high-quality evidence to establish an EAR and thus an RDA. Now we're in a different dilemma. Unlike potassium, where we had really good dietary intake that we think is associated with good health, here we know our current dietary intake is too high and is not associated with good health. So we could not, for sodium, just say, okay, well, let's take that number that everybody is taking, take the median and do that. So that was another concern. And you'll see, again, the CDRR helps us break that up. We also tried to look at the question of, is there a lower level of sodium, in essence, that should be recognized as do not go below this. And there was only one balanced study that was really very helpful in looking at that. And again, I'll show you how we tried to deal with that. So this is the final part on adequacy, on the regular role RDA part. And you can see it increased, sodium increased in people over 50, the recommendation, and that was because when we looked at that, there was not compelling data that says older people over 50, need less sodium than people, adults younger than that. So that's why that was the only place, though, that we made that kind of a change. And then you see in children from 1 to 13, there was actually a decrement because we had some new evidence that really did help us make better recommendations for children. And much of this really is based on, as you all know, often there are almost no data on children, but how to look at either an energy adjusted value, because sodium is so highly tied to energy intake. But the fascinating thing that none of us were really thinking about when we started is the core, 14 to 50, didn't change at all. We went through all of this work. We looked at 15 more years of evidence, some of which was based on the early evidence, because some of it was anchored by the very first DASH diets and all of that. But after this thorough review, because of, and this, let's go back. This goes a little bit about what we were talking about. If you only design studies that test intake between 4,000 or 5,000 and 1,000 or 1,500, that's the only data we're going to ever have, right? This process doesn't allow you to say, and thus we will just speculate about what happens below and above. So one of the things we think about, what would we like to have in the future? That's some of it. So as far as general intakes, well, where did that leave us? Now that we have an adequate intake, almost everybody is taking too much sodium. Okay, that's what this column, percent with intakes greater than the adequate intake in the US and Canada based on very recent data. So we're not in good shape. The issue of looking at toxicities, I'll just say that this was a chance for us to move away from historically, which had been more like case reports or industrial accidents or acute poisonings. And we, again, have a very nice review of the data. But in essence, there's no endpoint that we could say this should represent a number below which you would not have any adverse findings. The only thing that emerged that probably is worth looking at in future studies is that headache. So when people are in clinical trials, they're often asked, oh, how are you feeling? Have you had any other symptoms? And headache began to emerge, but was not well categorized. So one of the things we really hope is anybody doing clinical trials will do a really good headache survey. Don't let it be anecdotal. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot to mention I'm having more headaches or I'm having fewer headaches. So that could be interesting in the future. So in conclusion, there really is insufficient information to have a toxicity risk. However, this was now different from the conclusion before because they did actually come up with an upper limit. All right, so now what really was the new stuff? So when I talk to my friends who teach nutrition, to graduate students, it's like, all right, now you have to do a few new slides, okay? There is something now called the chronic disease risk reduction. It wasn't there last fall when you tried, Nutrition 101. You're gonna have to do this. So we again went back to that original review from AHRQ, and there were a number of findings that really had low strength of evidence or insufficient evidence. However, 5 things came out that had sufficient evidence to consider further. And you see those here. So all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease incidence, hypertension incidence, and then independently diastolic blood pressure and systolic blood pressure. So we had 5 databases that we could be working on. And this is the way we really characterized it. So if you decrease sodium intake, there is a high strength of evidence you'll decrease systolic blood pressure, high strength of evidence that you would decrease diastolic, which are independent measurements. And then if you go across to hypertension incidence and cardiovascular disease incidence, those had moderate strength of evidence. So that is, if you will, our mechanistic framework. Now, what we were able to do, as I was being a little cavalier about, if we don't design studies out on the extremes, we will never have data there. And this is really what the strength of the evidence of people in studies who had intakes up to 5,000. There was a moderate strength of evidence that between 5,000 and 4,100 that you do see an effect, a chronic disease risk reduction. In the area where most of the action is, and thus the highest strength of evidence, because we have thousands of people who've been in these clinical trials, we know a lot more now about what happens between 23 and 41. And less than 2,300, there's as low as you can go with any real evidence is at about 1,000. So this is our universe right now of high quality studies, 5,000 to 1,000. So what was the conclusion that we were able to see across those indicators? That there was sufficient strength of evidence to establish a sodium chronic disease risk reduction using those categories I've mentioned. And that because of the nature of these studies and the follow-up over the years, we're able to say that this is beneficial for both people who are normotensive or people who are hypertensive. Those last few adults who are normotensive, but because of the way the studies were designed and the longitudinal nature. So the hallmark then is for sodium, the risk reduction is the intake above which a reduction is expected to reduce chronic disease risk within an apparently healthy population. And that's sort of a whole new concept. And here are the one-liners depending on ages. So you can think about it, if you start with adults over 19, that if your intake is above 2,300, you can reduce it some. It was a similar number for the 14 to 18, and then you see the numbers. And now the challenge is going to be, both from a public health and from a clinical medicine point of view, is how to get this done. But if you're working with somebody who's 15 and their intake is above 2,300, you would guide them towards making changes. Now, how does this compare? You know, with the AI, everybody, almost 99% of everybody was over the adequate intake. But now we're trying to refine that to say, can nutrition really be talked about in real risk reduction? So this is, you know, now the new number based on what I showed you, and you can see that many, many children are above this number during their childhood. Depending on your age and sex, lots of adults are. And pregnant and lactating women, for the most part, are high. And I'll say we don't have huge amounts of data on pregnant and lactating women, but we had sufficient to really think about this. So now if you summarize this compared to where we were before, in 2005, they were looking at the early DASH treatments. They also looked at a good bit of information thinking about people who excess sweat loss and people who were not acclimatized, who might be in work settings or environments. When we looked at it, we were able to use the DASH trials. Now, over these 15 years, we had another 8 trials that were well-designed, moderate or high strength of evidence that let us use that for the decisions. Also, one well-designed balance study, and we looked for this and we found no evidence for associations with harmful effects if you took too little. They had used the term upper limit based on blood pressure in the old one. We do not have an upper limit here because everything we described with upper limit health consequences folded under the chronic disease, except for poisonings and industry accidents. And the take-home message is the new CDRR is really based on those 5 diagnostic or incident categories. So part of what today is, I think, is what do we need? So this is most of our comments on research needs. And we really have very poor methods to document intake. That's what I started with. We don't do well with getting food records, 24-hour records. Food frequency is complete junk because of the nature, you know, of all of this. We have very little data on potential toxicity, which means studies up in the higher ranges haven't been conducted. And the relationship to potassium and sodium is still of real interest. Some people believe there's probably a sweet spot with a ratio. We have insufficient evidence to do that now, but that certainly goes there. The idea of how do you put this in your genetics, your early life exposure, and that whole idea of developmental origins of health and disease. Are we doing things in utero or to young children that destines them to do this? And then the one I circle for this is the opportunity, and this is in the report, I didn't make it up for today, the opportunity to modify in the food supply. And then the other thing that I've already mentioned is we as healthcare and food groups have to think about, there aren't, in the traditional sense, the prevalence of chronic disease in the US, and to a lesser extent Canada, but not a lot less, is so high. This isn't like, oh, we're preaching to the 80% that are healthy. The 80% already are overweight and have hypertension. So how do we start to think about that as when you're building your whole thoughts, even your internal mission statements, not the ones that we all have to see, how do you think about this as part of your social responsibility? How do we think about it as our responsibility as the scientists? And then, other good ideas we hope that will help things. So I really did want to honor the sponsors, because this kind of work can only be done with sponsors who are independent and do not come into bias. This is one of those places, even though I'm pitching for investigator-initiated study, that wouldn't be allowed here. The whole DRI system now is a complete Canada and US joint project. So every time we do something, it's good for both countries. And we had a really great committee. The highlights, I said I brought a few of them here. The report is in its final form, can be downloaded for free, or you can buy it. I came on the train, so I didn't bring it, but it's about a 500-page book. It's got great review of literature for thinking about graduate students and all of that. So thank you. Hopefully that gives you an idea of how we got here, and now we got to figure out what to do.